showed there, but they are some of the most important. Yeah, I couldn't figure out what
So shall we begin? Thiruvalluvar once said, "If nations are at peace today, India's message of human well-being and harmony lies in the heart of it." India indeed lies in the heart of it. With the same objective of focusing on human-centric partnership through G20 and forging an inclusive global order in the 21st century, India Rights Network and the Center for Global India Insights welcomes you to this panel discussion. Good morning and greetings of the day. A very warm welcome to all of you. Before we begin, I request all of you to switch off your cell phones and keep them on silent mode, maintaining the dignity of this conference. We will begin our event shortly with the presentation of the token of gratitude, rose samplings to our eminent speakers. Firstly, I would like to invite Manish Chand sir to present a sampling to our keynote speakers, Honorable Mr. Harshvardhan Shringla. Now I extend my invitation to our interns and team members to present the saplings to the other distinguished panelists, Mr. Shombi Sharp, Mr. Amar Patnaik, Honorable Ambassador Ina Krishnamurthy, Honorable Ambassador Ina Krishnamurthy, Mr. Eduardo Uziel, Mr. Deep Kapuria, and lastly, Mr. Harshvardhan Singh.
No, Harshvardhan is done. Okay, no. Listen, just wait for 2 minutes. 1 minute, they're getting the magazine.
All right.
Mr. Sapling, you give it to him. You give it. Mr. Sapling for Mr. Sinha.
Now I invite all the panelists on the dais to unveil the special edition of the India and the World Journal that focuses on India's G20 presidency. The special edition, published by India Rights Network and edited by Mr. Chand, showcases exemplary articles and works by eminent diplomats, economists, and experts on the major priorities of India's G20 presidency.
So please, can we have a group photo? Can we unveil it, please?
We will now begin with our discussion of the day. For the same, I introduce you all to the chair and moderator of today's panel session, Mr. Manish Chand, who is the founder and CEO of India Rights Network and Center for Global India Insights, a think tank cum strategic advisory that focuses on geopolitics and actionable foreign policy analysis. He is also the founder and CEO of TGII Media Private Limited, and India in the World, an influential magazine journal focused on international relations. He has edited several publications and books, including Journeys Across Continents, A New India on the Global Stage, and 2 Billion Dreams, celebrating India-Africa friendship. He has worked for the leading Indian media organizations, think tanks, and bodies including IRS, Observer Research Foundation, and the Confederation of Indian Industries on research and consultancy projects. He has been interviewed by many news channels on foreign policy issues. Now I request Mr. Chand to chair and moderate the session. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Agya, for that introduction. A very warm welcome to all of you. Let me start. I think we have spent quite a bit of time in some of these rituals. So good morning to all of you. Guest of honor and keynote speaker, Sri Harshvardhan Shringla, India's G20 Chief Coordinator, Member of Parliament, Dr. Amar Patnaik, Her Excellency Ambassador of Indonesia, Ina Krishnamurthy, UN Resident Coordinator in India, Mr. Shombi Sharp, Mr. Eduardo Uziel, Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of Brazil, Sri Deep Kapuria, Chairman, the High Tech Group, Sri Ashish Kumar Sinha, Joint Secretary, G20 Secretariat in MEA. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, I welcome you all to this panel discussion entitled India G20 Moment, Forging an Inclusive World Order, a subject of immense importance and relevance in this conflicted and radically uncertain world where the only certainty is uncertainty. It's refreshing and energizing to see so many familiar faces, friends, and well-wishers among the audience on an April morning. April is the cruelest month, breeding memory and desire. So goes the famous lines of the famous poet, American poet T.S. Eliot. But in India so far, April has proved to be an unusually pleasant month, thanks to climate change, also an important theme of India G20 presidency. April also marks completion of 1/3 of India's one-year G20 presidency. Just the right time to have this important discussion on the journey so far and the road ahead. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here to celebrate India G20 moment, not as mindless cheerleaders, but as fellow travelers and observers in the evolution of this important, influential multilateral grouping. And India's rise is an emblem of hope, harmony, and healing, the triad that underpins India's G20 presidency. At this point, let me briefly say a few words about my organization and the thematic focus of our multifarious activities. My name is Manish Chand. I'm the founder and CEO of India Rights Network. We also publish India and the World, a foreign policy magazine journal that has carved a niche among the diplomatic and strategic community in India. For more on our organization and activities, you can find it on our website, www.indiarights.org. In the last few years, we have organized several important seminars, physical as well as virtual, on different reasons and themes. These panel discussions have been marked by the participation of eminent speakers and very high quality of discussions. And we hope that our panel discussion today on India G20 presidency will raise the bar for informed discussion on foreign policy issues. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, now let me unpack the central theme of today's conference. This is two interlinked sub-themes. What do we mean by India G20 moment? What is so special about India G20 presidency? You know, all the pomp and pageantry, the color and the optics we read about in the newspapers, and those of us who have participated in some of the G20 meetings is only part of the story. Some say that we are making a lot of noise about, after all, what is the rotational presidency of a multilateral grouping. Cynics can always say what they want, but in all fairness, India G20 presidency is special in many ways, as it comes at a time when India has emerged as the world's fastest growing major economy in a challenging international environment. India G20 presidency is a defining moment, not only for India, but also for the world at a time when there is not much good news, but a sense of gloom and doom following the Ukraine crisis. In such a despairing situation, the world is looking at India with a new glimmer of hope. Given India's unique position as a bridge builder between the global north and global south, there are greater expectations than ever from this country of over 1.4 billion people. Our keynote speaker, Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, and other esteemed speakers will have more to say on the subject. Now let me speak briefly about why we have chosen the theme of forging an inclusive world order. The answer is simple yet complex. Inclusivity lies at the heart of India G20 presidency. In his first speech after taking over the G20 presidency on December 1, Prime Minister Narendra Modi exhorted the world to move beyond confrontation and competition to cooperation and co-creation. He said India G20 presidency will work to promote the universal sense of oneness, hence our theme, One Earth, One Family, One Future. Making the G20 more inclusive and representative of a changing world and surging aspirations of emerging and developing countries will be a major long-term strategic goal of India's presidency. In this regard, the decision of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to place the Global South on the G20 agenda marks a turning point in the history of the grouping. So India G20 moment is about seizing the initiative to recast the G20 to reflect the priorities of emerging economies. With IPSA countries holding the G20 presidency till 2025, the next 3 years, India in 2023, Brazil in 2024, and South Africa in 2025, is the perfect opportunity for India to amplify the voice of the Global South, as Prime Minister Modi said. We are fortunate to have Indonesia's ambassador and Brazil's DCM to elaborate on this theme. Going forward, ladies and gentlemen, so what we are talking about today, essentially the discussions today will focus on how India can leverage the leadership of this multilateral grouping to fashion a more inclusive, hopeful, caring, and compassionate world. I have set the scene for today's panel discussion so that eminent speakers we have today can focus on specific issues arising out of the G20's quest for forging an inclusive world order. So let me outline some ground rules for today's panel discussion. Each speaker gets around 8 to 10 minutes to make his remarks in response to my questions. After each speaker is spoken, we plan to have Q&A with the audience. I would urge all speakers to stick to the time allotted and resist the temptation of being carried away by their own eloquence. Going forward, maybe G20 should consider a verbal economy and sustainable usage of words on its agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a star-studded, diverse, and eclectic panel, and we are extremely privileged to have speakers of such stature who can be justifiably called the G20 Brain Trust. So without much ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Shri Harshvardhan Shringla. Mr. Shringla really needs no introduction before this distinguished audience. Right now, he's perhaps the most sought-after speaker on events like these, and is therefore a small miracle, a miracle of sorts, that he could find the time to join us. He is the chief coordinator of India G20 presidency. His day starts with G20 and ends with G20. Prior to this, he was Foreign Secretary of India. In a 4-decade-long diplomatic career, he has been ambassador to the United States of America, Bangladesh, and Thailand. He was also Consul General of India in Durban, South Africa, and Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He's an experienced multilateral diplomat, having worked on 2 UN Security Council tenures, served in the Indian mission to the UN in New York, and permanent representative to UN Escape. This outstanding resume, however, does not do justice to his multifaceted personality and his many endearing traits that makes him such a caring and compassionate human being. On a personal note, I and Mr. Shringla share the same alma mater, St. Stephen's College. And not just Mr. Shringla, we have another Stephanian on the dais, or 2 Stephanians, Dr. Amar Patnaik and Mr. Deep Kapuria. And we have many more, including Mr. Sanjay Bhattacharya in the audience. So besides his gentle and effective diplomatic skills, Mr. Shringla loves heights. He's an avid mountaineer, a great photographer, and many more things, So all these facets of his personality are captured in a biography of Mr. Shringla that has just been published. It's called Not an Accidental Rise. So it's clearly not an accidental rise. He's worked his way to the top with a lot of hard work, perseverance, determination. And now I invite Mr. Shringla to deliver his keynote address. In your remarks, sir, you may like to give us a big picture view of the journey so far and what we can expect from India G20 presidency in the coming months, leading to the G20 summit in September. Secondly, we would like to hear from you the true meaning of forging an inclusive world and how India's G20 presidency can make a tangible difference in this area. You have around 20 minutes for your remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Manish, for those words of introduction. Ambassador Hina Krishnamurthy, Ambassador Shombi Sharp, Ambassador Eduardo Uziel, Shri Deep Kapuria, my colleague Joint Secretary Ashish Sinha, ambassadors of Mongolia, Syria, colleagues from the United States, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, distinguished guests, friends. Namaskar and good morning. So first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here at this conference organized by the Center for Global Indian Insights. Manish has been, from the very beginning, invested in the G20. I think he has made a lot of effort to understand what our G20 presidency is about. He's written extensively on it. And I think this magazine that we just looked at is really an illustration of his interest and the fact that he has put together some articles of I think, great utility on the G20 process and our presidency. We are waiting, of course, for the next edition, and we will look forward to that. The subject of today's discussion is India's G20 Moment, forging an inclusive world order. And I think it is the word inclusive that is really key to this topic today, and is one that I will try and focus on. When you say inclusive world order, I think it has a certain connotation. And that connotation, I think, has to be also looked at from the point of view of the current global situation, which Manish referred to as uncertain, and the only certainty being uncertainty. Now, if you look at the situation globally, of course, we had the devastating COVID pandemic, you've had the Ukraine conflict, and the impact of some of these black swan, rare black swan situations has really been has had consequences for the world at large. Global growth is faltering, inflation is rising. Growth at a worldwide level was at about 6% in 2021. It fell to 3.2% this year. It's likely to fall further to 2.7% next year. Inflation had reached 8.8% last year, but seems to be stabilizing at 5-6% this year. That's good news for everybody. But it is actually the developing world that has really borne the brunt of the consequences of many of these, let's say, global situations. And that has been, I think, manifested by slower demand for goods and services, lowering remittances, an increasing tendency towards indebtedness. According to IMF statistics, about 350 million people in the world from about 80 countries are at the risk of acute food shortages. There is also a fact that 60% of low-income countries are either debt distressed or at acute risk of debt distress. So essentially, indebtedness is increasing among the developing world. The good thing, of course, is that any growth today is largely accounted by the developing world also. 4/5 of global growth is from the global south, of which 15% is accounted for by India alone. Manish did mention that we are the fastest growing major economy in the world today. Looking at our own circumstances, we have, I think, come out of COVID in a manner that has been quite resilient economically. We have just commemorated the 75th anniversary of our independence. And in the journey, in the next 25 years will be critical. What we call Amrit Kal is a critical period for us to meet our stated objective of being a developed country by 2047. So the next 25 years is very important. And those 25 years is really the onus of securing that objective of becoming a $30 trillion economy from the current $3 trillion economy. It rises largely on many of the young people I see in the hall, and of course the youth of India. Those who are 25 today will be 50 in 2047. So I think this is the really the responsibility of taking us to that objective would be with you. But what is important is you prepare the ground to reach that phase in which you can achieve that objective of rapid economic growth, but inclusive growth. So, I mean, if you look at our objectives in the G20, the first objective is an accelerated, sustainable, and inclusive growth. So inclusivity is important in this regard. Of course, when we talk about the consequences today, it's not just in terms of development or economic growth, it is also in terms of faltering socioeconomic indicators. The SDGs, we are in the middle of this process, are also losing momentum, and it's important to ensure that the global community, the international community, looks at how to provide momentum to the SDGs. Climate change is another, I would say, collateral. Clearly, in some cases, we are also regressing. And we have to, again, look at how we can take many of these issues that are really global issues forward through the G20 process. Now, when you talk about inclusivity, inclusivity has to really come from within. And when you look at our presidency, I think we have tried to use inclusivity, or rather keep inclusivity foremost in our consideration when we have planned our presidency. The Prime Minister at the G20 Summit in Bali, and incidentally since Ambassador and I think that is where the imprint of the developing world will be very much felt in the G20 in a positive way, where you need that balance when you deal with matters of global importance today. When you talk about our own objectives, the Prime Minister, of course, as I said, spoke about an inclusive, ambitious, action-oriented, and decisive G20 presidency. But the first word was inclusive. So that is where we start, from inclusivity. When we look at the fact that we have decided to host the G20 presidency, not just in the capital, which is New Delhi. I mean, I think there are very few meetings that are going to be in Delhi. Our meetings will be on a pan-India basis across the country. Every state and union territory of India will have at least one G20 meeting. And I think that itself is inclusivity. We want to involve the states. We also want to take the message of the G20 and India's G20 presidency down to the grassroots levels through a people's movement, what we call Jan Bhagidari, through universities, schools, institutions, festivals, quiz competitions, selfie competitions, involve all sections of society. And I think there is already quite a great amount of traction within our country at the grassroots levels on the G20. So that enthusiasm also comes with you being a stakeholder, participant in G20 events, whether it's through seminars, conferences of this nature. How can we broad base our G20 presidency and take it across our country and make that resonate within our country? I think that's also a very important factor. And of course, our theme, again, Manish mentioned the theme of Vasushaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. When we talk about one earth, it also is inclusivity. We're talking about looking at the world in a holistic, comprehensive manner. Our concepts of one earth, one sun, one grid in terms of climate change, one earth, one health in terms of looking at health holistically is also translated into our theme of one earth. One family, of course, we see the world as one family, so it is not just nations, but actually citizens of the world. And of course, one future. That means as we go to the future, we are together. So that itself is, the theme itself is a symbol of inclusivity and carrying along all sections of the globe, developing, privileged, underprivileged. I think that's an important factor. When we look at our invitees to the G20, we have, every presidency has the option of inviting a certain number of countries, and we have invited, I think, a record number of countries from Africa. We have Nigeria, we have Egypt, of course, South Africa is already there. We have Mauritius from Africa. You also have Comoros, which is the president of the AU. And of course, NEPAD was with Rwanda, but now it's gone to Egypt, so you actually have Egypt handling, really wearing two hats. So a very significant participation in the G20 under our presidency from Africa. That is also into. Then the other factor, of course, is that as we have our meetings, we don't confine these meetings just to countries that are G20 members or invitee countries. We also extend invitations to other countries to join those meetings in areas of interest to them. For example, Denmark might be very interested in oceans health. We invite them to that particular meeting on oceans health. Nepal was very interested in financial inclusion. We kept them there. Our global partnership for financial inclusion involved some 40 different countries from the developing world. So we could share with them best practices and the model of financial inclusion that has been adopted. So in many senses, the way we have approached our presidency is an inclusive way that we have worked on it. When we look at our own domestic policies, and everything has to come from within, I think our approach has been, in many senses, very focused on how we can utilize or involve every part of our nation, in particularly the weaker sections of our population. So take digital transformations, for example. Digital public infrastructure is something that has been created keeping in mind the fact that government has to reach out to every part of our country. Every citizen has to have direct access to the benefits that government provides. How can you do it in a transparent manner, in a smooth manner, and in a manner that is corruption-free? So the direct benefits transfer scheme through a digital public infrastructure, through the Jan Dhan Aadhaar, as we call it, identity card, cheapest rates of internet telephony in the world, combined with banking the unbankable. 480 million of our citizens have been given new bank accounts. These citizens of ours could not open bank accounts earlier. They are today holding bank accounts, and benefits that governments transfer to them. It could be because of our National Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Scheme. It could be because of COVID assistance. Whatever benefits the government has to transfer to our citizens goes directly to their accounts. A further illustration of inclusivity is the fact that 57% of all beneficiaries under the direct benefits transfer system are women. In urban areas and in rural areas, it goes up to 65%. So women are also beneficiaries in that system, and women-led development is a major priority of our presidency, and another illustration of inclusivity in our approach to our G20 presidency. We also believe that lifestyle for environment, sustainable lifestyles is very important. The UN Secretary General, when he visited India and endorsed the concept of lifestyle for environment, pointed out that the world is today living at 1.6 times its ability to actually sustain what we consume. We need to lead sustainable lifestyles. It has to match our climate actions. It can't just be climate actions. It also has to be an effort that has to come from within, from every citizen of the world. We call it pro-planet people, people who want a sustainable lifestyle, who want to see our planet sustainable over time. And the concept of circular economy, waste to wealth. I was just speaking to our Member of Parliament, Mr. Amar Patnaik, who's also, we share the same alma mater as Manish pointed out, had talked about the fact that he is looking at how to have an exhibition during the G20 on waste to wealth, how to use art to demonstrate the concept of waste to wealth. I'm sure he will speak about it, but this is the sort of concept that we are trying to also take forward within the G20. Sustainability and sustainable consumption, sustainable production is also part of the SDGs. The SDG 12 is also about sustainability in that regard. Public health, ensuring through our public health programs, we have been able to administer over 2 billion vaccines to our citizens, which is basically through the CoWIN platform. We also have been able to utilize our Ayushman Bharat scheme, which is the largest public-funded health insurance scheme in the world, to reach out to over 500 million of our citizens. I'm just giving you examples of inclusivity in our approach towards development, towards how we can involve our citizens, especially those who are from the weakest sections of society. The concept of Ujjwala, where women who had to use firewood, who had to use fossil fuels, were given the option of using LPG. A very record number of new connections were given. Ensuring sanitation, 110 million sanitation areas were created across our country. Again, 110 million rural households. There are about 150 million, out of which 110 million were provided drinking water at their homes. The concept of Har Ghar Jal, which means that basically every house should have water. So inclusivity really means that making sure that every single citizen of your country is provided with the basic necessities of life, ensure that there is a certain social security backup in a certain sense for every of your citizens. You have to carry every part of your society with you. And when you come to foreign policy, we have followed, in many senses, the same approach. We have an Atmanirbhar policy, which means that we increase capacities. During COVID, we found that we were lacking the very equipment that we needed for COVID, whether it was masks, PPE kits, ventilators, liquid medical oxygen. But we ramped up production, and today we are among the top exporters of these products. As we grow and as we strengthen, we also help others. So working for the global public good has been a very important objective of our foreign policy. And that is illustrated during COVID times when we shared medicines like hydroxychloroquine with over 190 countries in the world. We shared Indian-made vaccines with countries through our Vaccine Maitri program. We also have doubled our development assistance quantum and our lines of credit from something like $14 billion to $30 billion. And of course, within the Indo-Pacific region, along with some of our partners, we are first responders and net security providers. If there is a natural calamity in a certain part of our extended neighborhood, we are very happy to be responsive to that calamity, whether it's in Sri Lanka, whether it's in Bangladesh, or whether it's in Mozambique. We have come forward to provide that. Not only, of course, assistance in natural calamities, but in the case of Maldives, ran out of drinking water, we were there to provide that. In the case of Mauritius, you had a huge oil spill. We were there to help them with that pollution crisis. So working for the global public good is an important objective of our foreign policy. When COVID broke out, Prime Minister Modi had suggested that the G20 should convene to see what it could do to address this issue. Saudi Arabia was the president at that time, March 2020, and they convened an extraordinary summit. And the Prime Minister said at that time, happened to be there with him, he said, this is the first time the G20 had met on what was essentially a humanitarian issue. Otherwise, the G20 has been meeting on financial or economic issues. And he called for human-centric globalization. And that was his appeal, that let us work for human-centric globalization. And I think the G20 did quite well. We had the debt service suspension initiative, which allowed developing countries to withhold interest or principal payments during the COVID crisis. The ACT Accelerator program. Indonesia made huge strides also in dealing with bringing the international community together to address the issue of COVID. So the G20 was galvanized, G20 did various things, and I think the G20 is a very representative body. It has representations from the developed world, the developing world, north and south, east and west. But that geographical and ideological representation also means that polarizations that are global in nature cut across the G20. It's important to make sure that the important issues that are there before us, issues that affect the rest of the world, we convened what is called the Voice of Global South Summit. It is our engagement and outreach to the developing world. 125 countries participated, including many heads of state and government. Our idea was to ascertain what the thinking was. What are the views of the developing world? What are the expectations? And many of them were quite candid in sharing. And I think across the board, if you look at our priorities in the G20, they are those that reflect the views of our G20 partners. They are those that reflect the views of countries across the world. So expectations are high. And I think it is incumbent on the G20 to deliver on the expectations of the international community at large. I think while there is enough to divide us, our approach of inclusivity, our approach of looking at the world as one family, really is saying that, look, let's work together to address what are the pressing issues of the day. Let us not get distracted. There are other realities. We do understand them, but I think what is important is that we take a larger view, take into account the interests of the larger community, all of us who are members of the G20, and take decisions that make a difference to the lives of people across the world. So whether it is accelerated, sustainable, and inclusive growth, whether it is providing momentum to the SDGs, whether it is looking at climate change and seeing how to take it forward, lifestyle for environment, whether it is reform of multilateral financial institutions to make their mandate stronger, to make them more responsive to the needs of the 21st century, especially the indebtedness that we see across the world today, or whether it is women-led development. I think these are very, very important areas that the international community in general and the G20 in particular has to look into. And I think we have a really very, very unique opportunity to make that vital difference. And I'm sure that we can work in the next remaining 4.5 months before we convene our summit to ensure that the outcomes are those that the G20 is incumbent on the G20 to achieve and is expected of us by the rest of the world. So I know that Manish is on a timeline. Thank you, Manish, for giving us this opportunity, and thank you all for bearing with me this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shingla, for that overarching view and you ended on a good note when you said that while there's enough to divide us, we should be really focusing on the things we can work on together. And inclusivity, which Prime Minister emphasized and which you brought out very vividly, that's going to be the defining, that's going to animate all that we do in the next few months leading to the summit. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Amar Patnaik. Dr. Patnaik is a member of parliament in Rajya Sabha from Odisha. He's also representing the Biju Janata Dal. He is the party's national spokesperson and head of the party's IT wing. Dr. Patnaik is the author of Pandemic Disruptions and Odisha's Lessons in Governance. Before becoming an MP, he had a long career in civil services. And he was also associated with the United Nations and the World Bank for global external audit assignments. I could go on, and just to mention that, he has been to some of the best, the most elite institutions, and written extensively on development policy issues. So now let me invite Mr. Patnaik to speak. My question to you, sir, is this, that you have authored an incisive book on how Odisha handled the pandemic emergency with the 5T framework of governance. Looking forward, in your view, how can India leverage its G20 presidency to build international consensus on forging global health resilience and an inclusive global health architecture? Are India and the world now better prepared for the next big global health emergency? Can G20 avert another pandemic of this nature? What is the way forward? Over to you, sir.
Can I speak from here?
Yeah, if you like.
Or you want me there?
Whichever way suits you.
Thank you so much, Manish, for inviting me to this panel discussion. Mr. Shringla, the ambassadors who are present on the dais and off the dais, ladies and gentlemen. I think Mr. Shringla has already given an expansive account of what India is doing, India has done, and the future ahead in G20. During the time of the pandemic, that's what Manish is talking about, a book which was released by Honorable Chief Minister of Orissa last year, but I had a book discussion in the India International Center where Manish was present, and the name of the book was Pandemic Disruptions and Orissa's Lessons in Governance. For those who probably do not or not very aware of the geography of India, Orissa is somewhere on the eastern coast of India, right after Calcutta. It's on the Bay of Bengal. I have written extensively during this particular period relating to on the subject of health. Mr. Shringla talked about inclusivity. As he said very correctly, inclusivity is something which has to be practiced by yourself if you were to preach to others. And that's what is the culture of India is based on that Vasushaiva Kutumbakam, which is inclusivity. During the time of the pandemic, the question that has been posed to me is limited to health, I would concentrate on health. Did we see this inclusivity in the global arena? Did we see this inclusivity in our own country? Did we see inclusivity within our own society? Now, if you look at the way India dealt with this once-in-a-100-year pandemic, I was in the parliament when this question was being raised several times during the session. Why did India send vaccine to countries that needed it when we ourselves were unable to give it to our citizens for some period of time? Because we believed in inclusivity. We believed that the three big issues in health are awareness, accessibility, affordability. So the point was the global South was not being able to access the vaccine. When countries in the world were having about the first dose of vaccination at about 60, 70, 80%, there were countries in Africa where the vaccination rate was about 2 to 3%. India took the lead, along with, I think, South Africa and New Zealand, to have a relaxation of the international agreement on intellectual property rights, the TRIPS, to remove the necessity for, taking the license from the big players who were giving the vaccines. Until and unless this particular provision, the idea of inclusivity cannot remain within the government itself. It has to be there across all stakeholders, the private players, the communities, the society itself. I think that is one glaring example which India has taught and which we have to take, the G20 probably has to take as a part of its strategy or part of its goal to devise a method in which, when we face the next pandemic, God forbid that happens, but if that does happen, then this compulsory licensing scheme, which enables countries to manufacture vaccine, not just by giving that license, but also transferring the technical know-how, has to happen. Now, this is something which we have to learn from this pandemic. India developed its own vaccine, not just one, number of them, and gave it to the world. India was the brightest star in the Gavi experiment of the WHO. Other countries didn't even participate. Now, this is something which I think we have to learn from the pandemic, and this is what we did. The second aspect is about universal health care. The universal health care, there are two models. The model that the government of India, Ambassador Shringla spoke about it, the Ayushman Bharat, which is an insurance-based model available to all citizens. That's the availability, accessibility part. But in Orissa, that's why I told you about the geographical position of Orissa. In Orissa, we follow a model which is true to the spirit of universal health care, which is an assurance scheme. It is not an insurance scheme. What is the difference? The difference is that you walk into a hospital, government hospital, you are not charged either for outdoor treatment or for indoor treatment. Nothing. As he said very correctly, and we all know that whenever there is a pandemic of this kind of a proportion, or whenever there is a natural calamity of any proportion, it is the poor who suffer the most. And when I say it is the poor, I also include that it is the women and the child who suffer the most. So an assurance scheme has been, it has been rolled out in Orissa since 2019, and it is a completely card-based system. In this card-based system, you just go to the hospital, government hospital, and you get whatever treatment completely free of cost. This is at the primary level. But that doesn't really solve the problem of universal health care, simply because of the fact that we have to invest in health infrastructure at the primary and the sub-primary and the district levels much more. We are nowhere near the world, the WHO standards. If India is grappling with this issue, I think the other countries in the global south could probably be grappling even much more with their expenditure on health as a percentage of the GDP of the country being much less. The important thing to learn from this would be that world has to continuously keep on spending money on public health, particularly at the community level, as a percentage of GDP. If you look at the multidimensional poverty index, which is a global index, it doesn't really talk about economic development only. It talks about health, it talks about education, it talks about quality of life. many of the emerging developed countries still figure low in the multidimensional poverty index. Not to say that they have not achieved. The reduction in multidimensional poverty by India has been enormous during the last 15 years, almost to the extent of about 24, 25 points. And Orissa is even more, 35%. But still, we have to do much more because India currently ranks at about, there are about 61 countries who are above India, which basically means we have to do much more. Now, this is something which we have to learn, which we have learned from the pandemic. We have to do not only in health, but also in education. The third important point, this is very interesting that I raised this question in Parliament once, that do we need a new metric for measuring development? We have been talking about it for long. But if you look at Stiglitz, he has been saying that we need a new metric because the three existential crises in this world, as per him, are climate change, inequality, and democracy. Democracy in the sense, not what we are talking about, but making institutions at the delivery point, at the rural level, at the district level, stronger. But if you look at all these three issues, the current calculation of GDP really doesn't take these into account. So I had walked up to Dr. Manmohan Singh to ask, so do you think we need? Then he talked about the SDGs. We already have the SDGs. Maybe a time has come when we talk about GDP, in the same breath we have to talk about the achievements of the SDG at the G20, at the G7, and everywhere. And then only the inequities that persist at the global level and within the countries themselves would probably be reduced to a large extent. Last point I'll speak about health. Besides the licensing, besides the fact that infrastructure, both physical and human resources, doctors, paramedic staff, people who can give injections, this was an issue. 1.4 billion, 2 million vaccine doses have been given in this country when our ratio of population to paramedic staff is much below the WHO standards. You can imagine the way the health community has participated in this process, but we have to do something much more. The last point that I was talking about is this, that global health education has to be standardized across countries. The movement of personnel, that is doctors, across countries has to be much more facilitative. I think in this way, any further or any more global health crisis could probably be addressed much better when the people, the paramedic, can actually move. There is a need also to ensure that the participation of the North and the South in the delivery of universal health care across the world has to be codified somewhere. I am a member of the Unite Global Parliamentary Network for Global Health. We have been talking about a pandemic treaty. To be prepared for the next global health crisis, we need to have a pandemic treaty which takes care of intellectual property, not sharing intellectual property, taking care of the shortage in the physical and human resource infrastructure in the area of health, and also talks about building the resilience of community, which we have shown in adequate measure in India, and particularly in my state. My state, Orissa, has been a forebearer in handling natural disasters and has been, Mr. Shorby would be knowing that it has been awarded internationally, accepted globally for its handling of the several cyclones. In fact, that is the protocol that really helped us to handle the pandemic because the Disaster Management Act, which we relied upon, we didn't really have an act which would particularly address the issue of health. That was the act which helped us. That was the protocol. Those were the protocols which helped us to have the community resilience to ward off, or let's say to negotiate the pandemic. when in Orissa we decentralized the power of the district magistrate collector to sarpanches, a decentralization process, it was in a way ensuring that not only the isolation exercise, not only the food distribution exercise, because global health pandemics are not necessarily concentrated only to health issues. There are issues relating to distribution of health, distribution of, food grains, distribution of cooked food to those people who even can't get food, distribution of food to children, distribution of, this was a big issue, which is blood to patients who require blood, from time to time, for example, the thalassemia patients. There are several other areas that really came up during the handling of the pandemic. So I think we need an elaborate international order in the form of a pandemic treaty, which would take care of this. That's what I've written about earlier in some of the publications here. I have been rooting for it, and that's, I think, the way forward. I would finish my comments with this, initial comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. I think that's an excellent suggestion to have an international treaty to deal with health emergencies. Going forward, our next speaker is Her Excellency Ina Krishnamurthy, who's been Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Indonesia. She has an outstanding diplomatic resume with postings in key world capitals and multilateral organizations. Prior to coming to New Delhi, she served as advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on economic diplomacy, and before that was Ambassador, Deputy Permanent Representative of Indonesia to the United Nations in New York. Besides diplomacy, she is passionate about issues related to women and children, as well as eager to strengthen network and collaboration on efforts to achieve SDGs 2030. Excellency, I have two questions for you. Some of us who were in Bali saw, how that Indonesia did a splendid job of staging the G20 presidency. And it was, despite all that happened in the run-up to it, it proved to be extremely successful in forging consensus on a lot of important issues. In terms of India's G20 presidency agenda, what are the points of convergence with Indonesia's major priorities? What are, broadly speaking, Indonesia's expectations from India's G20 presidency? And my second question is, India and Indonesia are among the largest developing countries and emerging economies. How can India and Indonesia collaborate in advancing interest of the global South? Over to you, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Manish Chang. Excellencies, honorable speakers on the dais, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think for the first question, I want perhaps allow me to go back a bit into last year presidency. We had 3 priorities, which is strengthening global health architecture, digital transformation, and energy transition. And we also put emphasis on strengthening the global partnership into more concrete, tangible, and impactful deliverables, so that the G20 outcomes would not merely be statements, documents, and that you could throw it away to the garbage bin. And also, we strive to get a direct impact for G20 to our grassroots. And for that reason, our presidency, we really try to establish projects, concrete projects, and we proudly could say that we have already commitments of 361 cooperation projects that worth around 283 billion US dollars, agreed at the summit. the G20 actions for strong and inclusive recovery. And to answer your question, Mr. Chan, I think Indonesia praises and commend India presidency for upholding the significance of continuity in the G20. I would kind of highlight two important points. Continuity and convergence happens when India is focused on pro-people. I just mentioned about the 361 projects from our presidency. Emerging economies such as Indonesia and India needs to focus on this particular issue, which is pro-people, because we have usually, in emerging economies, we have usually a large population. So we need to focus on the people. The second continuity and convergence also can be understood from the priorities that India has this year, which is, among others, life. Life is, for us in Indonesia, it's also a continuation because we want to enhance sustainable SDGs 2030 because of the pandemic. We forgot about SDG 2030. And then India make it stronger, even better with the life priority. So Indonesia believes that India is more than able and capable to advance the agenda of G20, and in particular, the interest of emerging countries. During the pandemic, I think already Mr. Ahmad Naik mentioned about the vaccine. Indonesia, I think, also benefit from India's policy on inclusivity in health, especially during the peak period of COVID-19 Delta variant. On digitalization, I think Ambassador Shringla already mentioned about many efforts that India has done throughout the years. And for us to learn about UPI, now Singapore already established kind of a platform that is include UPI. And now later in this year, Malaysia now also joined the effort, and Indonesia will also join the effort as ASEAN. So I think on digitalization, and there is no doubt that we need to learn from the achievement of India. On energy transition, again, International Solar Alliance is only small examples of India's leadership in this energy transition. So I think if anyone doubts India's leadership in energy transition or energy security, they need to look at what India has done throughout the years. So Indonesia has no doubt, if you talk about expectation, Indonesia has no doubt that India will strive and thrive this G20. On more serious note, last year and this year, G20 was caught at the center of global geopolitical storm, sort of. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's statement that this is not the era of war was an expression of hope. The leadership declaration, Bali Leadership Declaration, is a concrete implementation of the hope. So we believe that G20 is a living proof that G20 can be a bridge for divisions. It is an expression of optimism that global cooperation still existed. When we talk about G20, we need to also acknowledge that of all international groupings, this is one of the most diverse membership as well as invitees and observers there is, including the international organization. So G20 should be, or I think is an avenue where maybe not fixing all problems or challenges, but an avenue to people to just sit and talk between each other. And we saw it during FMM G20 in New Delhi, where people see very pessimistically what is happening in the negotiation table. But if you see in the venue where the bilateral rooms are packed, the schedule are, there are so many schedules of bilaterals between ministers that have, collided somewhat, because there is an eagerness of dialogue. There is an eagerness of at least find a room or a window of understanding between each other, although the negotiation table is somewhat dead end. So I think challenges that may happen in the negotiation room should not make G20 lose sight of its main objective in addressing urgent global challenges, because at least G20 give us a room, an avenue to be there in one room and then listen to each other. I think I somewhat answered the second one, but I want to highlight what Ambassador Shringla said about inclusivity domestically, but I want to highlight about inclusivity in international politics, especially SDGs, while we have Mr. Sharp here, that for the first time in the history of G20, 4 emerging economies is on the leading role. But no one can forget that SDG cannot be achieved unless first the voice of developing countries, emerging as economies in many multilateral fora is not heard. So we need to voice out again and again, what do we want in climate change, in water security, food security, energy security. So we need to voice out what we want. India has started with life. I hope Brazil, as also the leading chair for COP in 2025, also will talk about sustainable living. So we need to voice out what emerging economies and developing countries want in multilateral fora. Second, about mobilization of resources, because I think in the imbalanced world, geopolitically and geoeconomically, we need to also mobilize adequate resources for everyone. We must to remember the principle of SDG 2030, which is inclusivity that mentioned by Ambassador Shringla, no one left behind. And 2, include all in the SDG 2030 achievement. We need to mobilize resources, be it from triple helix, quadruple helix, or whatever means, but we need to do that so that the voice of emerging economies is listened. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent note to end on, no one to be left behind. And thank you for your infectious optimism about the way ahead, about India's presidency. At this point, Mr. Shringla has got an important meeting. He has to leave. Can we stand for a group photo before you leave? Mr. Shringla, so we want to just showcase this book. This is his biography, which is just being published. And I just got a copy of it, so I wanted to talk about his Dr. Patnaik also has to leave. These are super busy people. You can't hold them back. Not that others are not.
There's a committee meeting.
Parliament is being affected. It's now my pleasure and honor to invite Mr. Shombi Sharp, UN Resident Coordinator for India. Mr. Sharp, a US national, has been in Delhi since November 2021. He has devoted more than 25 years of his career to promoting inclusive and sustainable development internationally, bringing experience he's acquired at the United Nations and externally to this new position. So he's just the right person to expound on the subject of such great importance. We are, within the organization, he most recently served as the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Armenia after holding several important leadership positions at the UNDP. I'll skip the rest of the bio because then we can just go on talking only about the bio. My questions to you, Mr. Sharp, are two. I have two questions for you. Number one, we've been talking about global reforms, governance reforms, but they seem to be essentially rhetorical tricks. It's not just going forward, that's the overwhelming impression. Accelerating reform of global governance architecture is one of the key priorities of India G20 presidency. How can the UN work with India to advance the democratization of the international order? Number two, we have been hearing about the reform and expansion of the Security Council for ages. How do you see this going forward? What's holding back the expansion, and what's the way forward, sir? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sri Manishchan, for bringing us all together here today, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be here on the dais with the fellow dignitaries. Welcome to everybody else here in the room, also the international community and representatives from government and civil society, business, especially the young people in the audience. Namaste. Mujhe aap sab se milkar bahut acha laga. It's great to be here with you today. I think, maybe just quickly step back about the context. Has already been mentioned, and I feel like my job's been made much easier by already the fantastic commentary that I fully agree with, and a great focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and 2030 Agenda. So, again, to reiterate, as we know, we're at a really tough moment in time in history. This kind of overlapping, cascading crises. We couldn't even get out of the pandemic yet completely. It keeps threatening, to come back, and we're facing the terrible consequences of a senseless war. We see economic development being pushed back across the world. The cost of living, especially for those basic necessities in life, food and fuel, increasing, especially for the poorest countries and communities. Debt crisis now, again, pushing the poorest countries to the edge of the precipice. And, this comes against the backdrop of the greatest existential crisis of all that we sort of almost forgot about for a little bit, which is the triple planetary crisis, especially climate change. I'm not sure about this last month, March, but I know February was the hottest on record here in India. And as the Secretary General has said, quite soon the hottest temperatures today will be the coolest of tomorrow, which is a frightening thought. I think we have something like 50% chance, even within the next 5 years, of already experiencing an average temperature globally of more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So the SDGs are still the unifying agenda that we need to keep focus on, and I want to speak about the importance of India's G20 presidency and keeping us on track in that regard, because we've seen for the very first time, as we're at the halfway point of the 2030 agenda, as has been mentioned, not only are we suddenly not making progress, we're actually being pushed back, rolled back. Human development indicators have declined for the first time ever 2 years in a row for most of the countries in the world. Food insecurity has increased almost 3 times since pre-pandemic levels, and again, debt crisis. You see well over half of developing countries either already in a debt crisis or very much at risk of being in a debt crisis. And the majority of those countries are the ones most severely affected by climate change as well. You know, the last 8 years have been the warmest on record. It's really almost absurd. If you want to see what were the 10 warmest years on record, well, you pretty much look at the last 10 years. 15? Last 15 years. 20? Last 20 years. I mean, it's insane. Yet the goal in financing, as Ambassador Krishnamurti was saying, just continues to grow. So we're already, you know, we talked about 100 billion a year. We're at a trillion a year that we need just for climate. We need 4 trillion a year financing gap for the SDGs across the board. As the UN Secretary General said here in Mumbai when he visited a few months ago, last year, you know, the SDGs are in need of an urgent rescue. There are some bits of silver linings, some good news here and there. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is important to help stem the impacts of the immediate crisis of the Ukraine war, has been extended. I think over 25 million tons of grain have been released, helping to reduce considerably the pressure on prices for the world's, you know, commodities. The High Seas Treaty, after a decade of efforts, was just agreed last month, putting 30% of the world's seas now in protected zones. And India is a big part of this optimism, and the G20 leadership right now just happens to be kind of the headline moment, the G20 moment, as we're talking about. But there are so many other reasons. As has been mentioned, I mean, the world's largest democracy, the greatest youth generation in history. India is positioned better than, as well, if not better than any country I can think of, to bring countries together across divides in any dimension, north, south, east, west, you name it, G7, G77, G20 in the middle. As the Secretary General did mention as well, it is India that will make or break the SDGs. And part of that is because something like half of some global targets need to be met here in India. So it's both a domestic story and it's an international global leadership story as well. And I won't go into the details, but you know, we've seen hundreds of millions of people in India brought out of poverty in recent years, and hundreds of millions more will need to be brought out of poverty to reach the 2030. We see, you know, electrification, access to clean water, incredible advances in financial inclusion, digitalization, as has been mentioned. Unbelievable investments in renewable energy, the private sector here as well. You know, I'm always amazed. Electric auto rickshaws, you know, sort of didn't exist when I arrived just a year and a half ago. Now you see them popping up, the blue ones in Delhi, and you think, wow, in a few years they're going to be everywhere. This is just one fascinating symbol of the pace of change of what's happening here. And India's leadership on climate action at the global level, the Panchamrit targets of Prime Minister Modi and COP26 are truly, truly amazing. I think India is now the 4th largest country in the world in terms of renewable energy investments, and that's coming online faster and faster to reach 500 gigawatts. The LIFE mission of Prime Minister as well, truly important. International Year of Millets. I mean, millets really are a miracle food when it comes to both nutrition and food security and sustainability as well. So G20, the alignment is so clear with the SDGs that I've been calling it the SDG 20, because truly the goals are essentially the same, which is to try to rescue the SDGs, bring the focus back from, you know, political divides back to the understanding of especially how the poorest and developing countries are being affected the most. And this is where India's legitimacy, both having demonstrated the inclusive development that we've been talking about at home, and then having a legitimate, trusted voice straddling so many of these different dimensions is something quite unique. The G20 presidency of India is focusing on bringing a G20 SDG action plan right to, basically there's a handshake immediately when the leadership summit happens here. A matter of days later, we go to New York for the SDG Summit, the global stocktake. And so India will come, hopefully with a fully prepared acceleration action plan, so like bringing a prepared meal to the table, so to speak. Also working closely, I know the presidency is focused on trying to get traction for the Secretary General's SDG stimulus plan into the G20, which would be an important means of addressing this lack of financing, the $500 billion that it calls for. And other important priorities like debt restructuring, the MDB reform, reforming the international financial architecture. There's a great partnership between India's presidency and the Bridgetown initiative and President Macron's initiative as well. So I think right now as we speak, Finance Minister Sitaraman is in DC at the spring meetings. We'll be taking part in India's hosting of the second G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. So this is all about those reforms. So I think it's inescapable how important India's leadership is right now at this moment in time as we are precisely at the midterm mark for the SDGs. On Security Council reform, there we had the President of the General Assembly here again just a few months ago. He sort of said, well, the bad news is that we've been working on this reform for 2 decades, essentially, right? But the good news is that there has never been more momentum. And at the General Assembly last year, 73 countries spoke out, heads of state and heads of government spoke out and demanded Security Council reform. So it is, of course, this is the domain of member states' decision making. The UN itself, I mean, staff and the Secretary General don't play that role. This is for the member states. But we do see, and as the Secretary General said, really for the first time, the majority of member states are acknowledging that we need that reform to reflect the world as it stands today. Personally, I can't imagine, I mean, when it happens, you couldn't imagine a country with a better sort of resume than India, but let's see, this is up to the member states, but we do see reason for optimism there, and of course, India has been a big proponent of that. And I would just mention 2 other areas of important reform that India is a strong proponent for. One is counterterrorism efforts. The SG placed that as a priority when he first arrived, created the UN Office on Counterterrorism. India has been leading, for example, was president of the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, brought that committee here to India. The Delhi Declaration was very important contribution in modernizing counterterrorism efforts into the digital sort of world and drone technology and that sort of a thing. India's investing in the trust fund for counterterrorism as well. And then peace and security on peacekeeping. I mean, I can't ignore that because I happened to just take part in a ceremony recently, a few weeks ago. India handed over 150 heavy vehicles, armored vehicles and such to the peacekeeping efforts in South Sudan. But India is the largest troop contributing country in the history of peacekeeping and continues to make incredible sacrifices and support to the global peace and security architecture. So let me stop there, but I think the moment absolutely is now, and the place to be is here in India. Thank you very much. Bahut dhanyavad.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp, you are the quintessential American optimist, and it shines through what you said, and I hope a lot of what you say proves to be true. Thank you also for putting the focus on the centrality of SDG agenda, SDG 20. I think unless we achieve that, all this talk of transformation would remain just talk. So thanks for that restating the emphasis on the SDG. We have so far heard diplomats speaking on India G20 presidency, so let me give you a bit of a break and bring on the stage Mr. Deep Kapuria. He's chairman of the high-tech group. The business perspective, a lot of people say the business of diplomacy is business. So it's important to have that business perspective. Mr. Deep Kapuria, the chairman of the high-tech group, comprising a set of interrelated companies, the high-tech gas, the high-tech engineering systems, the high-tech e-soft and high-tech robotics systems. He's co-chairman, CIA National Committee on International Trade and Trade Policy, and past co-chair of Digital Economy and Industry 4.0 Task Force of B20 Argentina. He has also contributed an article to our special edition on India G20 presidency, so I'm really grateful that he could come here. My questions to you, Mr. Kapuria, are twofold. How can business and industry help in advancing India's overarching G20 agenda of creating an inclusive world and fashioning a more representative international economic order? In this regard, how do you see the role of B20? Secondly, in what ways can India G20 presidency shape resilient global value chain, GVCs, in accordance with inclusivity and human-centric approach of development? Over to you, sir.
Mind if I come
Yeah, please.
I decided to come here because I just like to speak while standing, and second, you don't have a lot of those lights looking at you, and you can't look at the audience any which way. So thank you, Manish, for giving me this opportunity. The excellencies in the audience and here, of course. It was a tremendous opportunity for me to be at Bali and be also a part of one of the panels for the B20. And what a concluding ceremony. Congratulations to you, Ambassador. Immense, I mean, right under the aegis of Lord Vishnu and Garud that we had the dinner. It was phenomenal. There was a lot of mention on the SDGs. I have been engaged with the B20 process for a while, and it was the main focus in the Japanese B20, where they tried to etch out and taking SDGs as one of the core fundamentals and tried to create what is called the Society 5.0. And that has been in many forms taken up by the further presidencies, not in that format, but similar formats. We all know that the last 3 presidencies had major challenges of various kinds. We also know that we are having the similar challenges for us as well. And what is impacts in terms of the business? So let me bring in the business lens and talk to you about that. I don't know how many of you here in the audience are interested in businesses or are engaged in any businesses. I won't want you to raise your hand, but I would assume not very many. However, I would try to address the 2 questions given to me, and I would be more down to a level of 5,000 feet and not at the policy level kind of addresses which the diplomats and of course, the member of parliament was right down on the ground while he was talking about how the pandemic and the vaccination was handled and the basic health care around that. I think we're all aware, but just to let you know, or just to make you aware, because it's a very different lens that I'm speaking about, is the global trading system was also impacted, and it was a major setback. One of the key drivers for this was the issue of disruption of supply chains. The prime example was the vaccine. We all know that how the APIs just couldn't be transferred to where the locations were and where the manufacturing was happening, and how the distribution networks were also disrupted. And since, excuse me, since the fallout is that various countries and various businesses have started de-risking themselves in a way that laying greater emphasis on self-reliance. Not that it is wrong, but this reduces the dependence on offshoring and inshoring and gets to inshoring, and that in itself is changing the structural aspect of the global trade. The numerous countries, as ambassadors would know, and the diplomats too, have followed it up with behind-the-border measures in policy initiatives and regulated trade flows. Thus, in these times, if we see that more and more use of non-tariff measures and in the garb of standards is also one of the key issues which the businesses are being, specifically the businesses of the emerging economies are tending to be challenged with. I must also address one of the key drivers of the change, that's technology, which actually got accelerated during the pandemic. The net impact was that there was unprecedented growth of the digital economy, and there has been an advent of various platforms and applications which are using smart tech. I think today nobody needs any introduction to Zoom. I mean, we all know what that is. But nevertheless, it also is now a very thin line between goods and services. That's one of the major changes. The important feature is, which likely to emerge in the future, is digitalization and the growth of digital trade, which is now being termed as servification of manufacturing value chains. So the value-added content of trade and its movement would be more and more towards services and value-added content around that. Now, contending with these issues and changes, the industry is trying to be in sync with the G20 agenda and recommending policy and regulatory initiatives which can focus and drive on sustainable practices in trade policy. As increasingly countries and businesses embrace the concept of green economy and initiative, businesses too are adopting the practices of green logistics, climate resilient infrastructure. And it's also, many of the businesses are adopting ESG principles that we know about. The B20 recommendations is to lay greater emphasis on regulations concerning standards and harmonizing, but harmonizing, I say with a caveat. Being also the chair of NABCB, which is a QCI body, we have been strongly recommending a flexibility, and that is true because G7 countries within the G20 have certain thoughts, and the emerging economies would like to see the adoption of standards, not exactly in terms of harmonization, but given the time and commitment for this harmonization of standards to happen. I think this is a critical piece for businesses and how the G20 agenda through B20 can be deployed. All this could happen as we need support of the G20 to build requisite infrastructure in supporting the regulatory mechanism. There's a sufficient potential for businesses and industry to collaborate in emerging sectors such as digital technologies, biotech, space, now AI, etc. But given the commitment of G20 to promote innovation and entrepreneurship, B20 can definitely help in leveraging the strengths of the SMEs, which are a very important component of businesses to maintain the inclusivity not only in businesses but also overall aspect of wealth distribution. So the equitability is very important. Let me now address the issue of trade and sustainable development with environments such as opportunity and challenges. No doubt, each country is making an effort to transit to a low carbon economy. However, G20 India must address the issue that it doesn't look at imports from the developing economies and overwhelmingly get dependent on imports on green products and green technologies by the G7 countries. In order to ensure this transition to clean and green economy, it's not only economically but socially disruptive, for unless the developing nations are fully also supported with transfer of technology, not only during the pandemic, but generally for green technologies, you need to be easily transferring technologies and sharing the IPRs. And besides that, we also need to see that the G20 India finance track, which is getting to also talk about sustainable and inclusive funding if we are to see an inclusive and a sustainable world, the developing nations will have to be funded in very innovative ways, and that is also should be one of the major tracks of G20 India. I don't want to get into the details because of the paucity of time, but it is very clear that finally we need also to transit to digital transition and digital security and bridge the digital divide so that more and more inclusivity right down to the last man standing in the queue is also there. Just on the last points of GVCs, the GVCs are a very, very important and neural system, and one needs to understand that today the complexities of global supply chains or value chains as we know them are not linear anymore. They are what we would call now networks. Networks where not only a product flows once or twice across the border, but also a collaborative data also flows back and forth. So being countries termed as data secure or data unsecure is very, very disruptive, and one needs to see that how inclusive part of this to promote the GVCs, specifically with the South-South trade or South-North trade, is taken care of. I would last just talk about the critical issues which the businesses are going to be facing in the future, and some of these complexities are going to come through carbon neutrality issues and some of the regulatory issues which already we see in the EU. I think this is a must that to help the SMEs. It is very important for them not only to understand the standards and regulatory mechanisms, but skilling in a proper way so the businesses are more inclusive and the SMEs also a part and parcel of it. Thank you.
Master, you would like to leave? Okay. All right. So thank you so much. I have to leave. Don't forget to carry your sapling. Green is a mantra of India's G20 presidency. Okay, friends, I think it's just stretching a bit. I can already see hunger pangs and, lunch waiting and all that. So let me now bring in Brazil's DCM, Eduardo Ziel. Brazil is the next, after India's president. Brazil takes over from India. So Brazil's role is going to be critically important. Brazil is already part of the Troika. Mr. Uziel is a Brazilian diplomat since 2000 and is posted in the Brazilian mission to the United Nations, in the embassy in Tel Aviv, in the mission of Brazil to the EU, and in the embassy to New Delhi, where he is currently the deputy chief of mission. He is also a PhD candidate in political science in the University Libre de Bruxelles, studying the absence of Brazil from the Security Council reform from 1969 to 1987. He has published several books and articles on UN peacekeeping and Security Council affairs. He was professor of international organizations in the Instituto Rio Branco. So what we have from him is a mix of an academic, quasi-academic, and diplomatic perspective. There are two questions for you, sir. How can India and Brazil cooperate in projecting and promoting the interests of developing countries and shape the consensus on issues of common interest in G20? As Brazil takes over the presidency of G20 after India, what are the common priorities of India and Brazil in G20 and other multilateral forums? You have 8 to 10 minutes, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for the presentations before, and thank you for having me here, Mr. Chand. First, I would like to say that for Brazil, it is quite an opportunity to cooperate with India in G20, not only for the G20 itself, but also because of our bilateral relationship with India, of which I take care on a daily basis with my colleagues at the embassy. And this year we celebrate 75 years of the relationship, so it's a very important date, and we are very glad that we can put it all together with the G20 by succeeding India in the presidency. But the truth is that Brazil and India are already cooperating for some years now in shaping international agenda bilaterally. We have a strong relationship, increasing trade, increasing investments, but we cooperate already in several fora, IPSA, BRICS, BASIC, G4. So the truth is that this cooperation has already begun between India and Brazil, and it's only going to be strengthened by this succession in the G20 presidency. And the importance of this goes back to the very nature of G20 and how it was born, how it was created, better saying, originally as a forum to discuss economics and to discuss financial measures, where the emerging economies were the differential factor. Because G7 had existed for a long time before, but they are a homogeneous group of economies with certain perspective of the world, in many ways satisfied with the global order. And in G20 we have this chamber of resonance exactly because the emerging economies like Brazil, like India, like Indonesia, like South Africa are present. And it's very fortunate, this succession of four developing countries in the presence of G20. On my perspective, particularly the fact that it will be, as mentioned by Ambassador Shringala, IPSA will be the next three presidencies, India, Brazil, and South Africa. So there are many areas where we can mention cooperation, but I would like to highlight two. Rather arbitrarily, I have chosen them, but just because time also constrains us, and I want to mention this too. So first, as I was joking with Mr. Sharp here when he was speaking, is the Security Council reform. I mean, this is something that, how can you put a Brazilian and an Indian diplomat in the same room and not talk about Security Council reform? Yes? And this is long overdue. Mr. Sharp said correctly, I mean, it's not his place to talk about the substance of the reform, although it's clear that the majority of the world, of the countries of the UN is in favor. It's long overdue, and if the current geostrategic situation proves anything, is that we need different perspectives in the Council. We need creative solutions. We need new ideas and new impetus, a new momentum for change. And definitely what the G4 has been proposing for a long time is the correct way. We have to have adjustments, of course, and this is the very point of negotiation. But this is something that India and Brazil and South Africa actually can bring to the G20, this mainstreaming this issue of reforming, let's say not only reform, but improving the global governance institutions. And the second one is less evident, but it's very important, increasingly important for Brazil and India and for the world, and it's part of sustainability and the fight against climate change, which is biofuels. Recently, Minister Puri, who is a very close friend of Brazil, was ambassador in Brazil and very close friend of a country, has launched in Bangalore the Global Biofuels, International Biofuels Alliance, Global Biofuels Alliance, sorry, I always confuse the exact title. And this comes from, I dare say, from our cooperation between Brazil and India. Because, and this is something that is shared by many developing countries of the South, which is biofuels are a very important path to sustainability because they are cheaper, they don't require new technology, they are cleaner than most sources of energy, mainly for urban mobility. And this is an experiment that India has inserted in G20, and I'm sure that Brazil will pursue. Now, I change for the next question, which is, in preparing this presentation, I called my friends in the Sherpa and the Sous-Sherpa in Brazil and asked, okay, so tell me, what are the Brazilian priorities for G20? And they laughed on the other side. They said, well, be candid with them. Tell them we're still working on them. Because, of course, Brazil went through a very steep political transition, and we are still working on them. We'll have them soon, but we cannot be definitive at this. However, he said to me, it's also evident that certain themes that are present in India's presidency will continue. Yes, sustainability, strengthening the SDGs, digital inclusion, fight against hunger and poverty. They are all issues that will for sure be priorities for Brazil too. How exactly we are going to shape them, how exactly we are going to address them, they are still to be decided. Yeah, so I can also add gender issues and indigenous peoples as issues that are going to be present in our presidency. And I think they dovetail very well with India's priorities. And I'm very sure, I cannot speak for them, but I am very sure that it will dovetail also with South Africa's. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Azil, for this very precise, very admirable presentation. I think with Brazil in the saddle, India and Brazil are going to be working very closely on one issue, regardless of when Brazil gets its priorities right, because that's a tortuous process, and I think India has also been through that. But before that, also would like to thank Mr. Kapuria for highlighting the interest of the business community. I forgot to do that at that point. So now moving on, our last speaker, my good friend, Mr. Ashish Kumar Sinha. And the reason I called him towards the end, that he's the last remaining official of the Indian government at the dais. Okay, so thematically, and he can handle some of the questions as well. So let me briefly introduce him. Mr. Sinha is a career diplomat with over 17 years of experience in the Indian Foreign Service. Before taking over the position of Joint Secretary G20 in the Ministry of External Affairs, he served as India Deputy High Commissioner in Nairobi. Since joining the IFS in 2005, he served as a counselor in the permanent mission of India to the United Nations in New York for 3 years. He has some key postings in Spain and Nepal. He was also handling as the desk officer the very crucial portfolio India's relations with Pakistan. So he has a very diverse sort of experience, but more important is his current job, which focuses on G20. He is a person, I mean, you know, India had, I don't know, we hosted, I think, 40 events so far, Ashish? So far? Maybe.
Well, if we include side events, we'll very soon be at the century.
Oh, wow, century. So Ashish is everywhere, involved with it. Again, to have Ashish over is not a small thing. So thank you for coming. Let me ask you the question that in G20 Secretariat, you have been handling issues related to startups and businesses. Let's talk about startups, the role of, I would request you to speak about how startups can help in actualizing major priorities of India's G20 presidency, and also the whole idea of inclusion, which is inherent in the idea of startups, right? Over to you, Ashish.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you for having me here in the panel, and dignitaries and off and on the dais, left and present. Thank you very much. I really compliment all those who are still awake and attentive. Including me. So I'll keep it very simple, and I'll share my understanding on the subject which is asked. So Startup 20 is an engagement group, and for those who do not understand the G20 structure, I did not before our presidency, engagement groups are away from government. They are non-governmental entities, and there are about 10 or 11 of them. In our presidency, there are 11 because we've added one, which is Startup 20. Their role is primarily to discuss and deliberate with their counterparts in 20 countries and invited countries on the specific subject. And these people are, unlike working group where they represent government and government's position, in engagement group, they are actual stakeholders, the businessmen in Business 20, the actual startups in Startup 20 or venture capital or hedge funds, so people from the same ecosystem. It's Urban 20, so entities involved in urbanization, Think 20, which is of think tanks. So engagement groups are primarily non-governmental forums. They discuss, deliberate, and provide their recommendations to the government, to the presidency for consideration. So to that extent, they have a recommendatory role. They have much more freedom compared to working groups to decide the agenda, to decide the issues that they feel relevant because they are actual actors on the ground. So they are more connected with the reality and the actual current issues. And they have the flexibility to even calibrate and recalibrate within the course of a presidency. Suppose something happens tomorrow, which is important for that engagement group's perspective, then they can include in the agenda. Now coming back to the Startup 20. Startup 20 is an engagement group started, formed, established during the Indian presidency. It was a difficult task. G20 agenda has already been proliferated a lot from where it started. You've heard already that it started as a mechanism between finance minister and central bank governors of the 20 countries, later elevated to the summit level with leaders. And then gradually it has evolved to include almost all the issues of governance, from energy to agriculture to education to digital economy. So it has actually filled the calendar of meetings. Therefore, there's a great reluctance from countries to add a new group, be it a working group or an engagement group. But given India's credentials in the startup arena, we've been able to establish a new engagement group, Startup 20. Similarly, in working group, we have established a new working group on disaster risk reduction. And those who follow the events, they can understand that naturally India has a leadership position in these two areas. Specific to Startup 20, in India we have developed startup ecosystem. India is said to be the third largest ecosystem in startups. India has backed it up with adequate legislative and financial positions. And we have over 100 unicorns, over 85,000 startups in the country. Therefore, we were able to propose this from the position of strength to the G20 membership. And they accepted it because of its uniqueness and the requirement felt. It was clearly felt that Startup 20, if it is discussed only as a part of Business 20, will not be able to do justice to its potential and its need. So we have established, now we realize that this is actually a very greenfield virgin territory. Many of the things are yet to be harmonized, starting from definition as to what a startup is, or what kind of stakeholders, players, ecosystem, financing. So all these issues are being discussed. We have set it on our presidency's agenda. We've had 2 meetings already, one in Hyderabad and one in Sikkim, and we are moving ahead. Startups, and I'll come back to the answer of inclusion, how it is addressing inclusion and Indian presidency priorities. But you see how startups have become so important. They are so agile and nimble to respond to any situation. During the COVID, if you see, from the industry part, most players were startups who were involved in vaccine production, making research, supply chain, or PPE kits. So startups are the one which have greatest flexibility, energy, potential for job creation. And if you see, they do it with the least possible carbon footprint by virtue of all the peculiarity and specifications that they have. Most startups are also in the area of data and digitalization, which has become the most important transformation in the world, led by countries like India. And so, on the presidency's priority, if you see, our presidency priority actually is inclusion. Vasushaiva Kutumbakam, which means, the whole earth is a family, and one earth, one family, one future. So everything we talk from the very word, from the very theme of our presidency is about inclusion. Then if you break it down to our priorities, it's, climate finance, again about inclusion of developing countries into the climate action. And that requires that the committed finance flow from developed countries to developing countries. We have talked about the accelerated achievement of implementation of SDGs, inclusive and resilient economic growth, digital transformation, including UPI and all that. So UPI again is the biggest financial inclusion tool that we've seen. As against many other countries where digitalization or such payment interfaces have been there, but then in Indian context and in emerging market context, such tools become the inclusion tools. We approach and use these technologies from the point of development. Primarily, we address the developmental issue through such digital prowess and transformation, be it UPI, be it ONDC, CoWIN platform, Aadhaar system, the unique ID system. So each one of these is inclusion. And this is what we are presenting on the table for G20 members to discuss, deliberate, share with each other, learn from Indian experiences, and India is willing to learn from their experiences. But please collaborate on these so that the rest of the world, which is yet to see the fruits of digitalization and data for development, gets benefited. You see, the world is increasingly getting connected with internet, yet there's a digital divide. You know, while we are talking of the data for development, we must address the issues that we have seen already and we foresee that will come in future. We have to talk about data privacy, we have to talk about cross-border data flow, we have to talk about a digital divide, and as a developing country, we should also talk about digital skilling. So in developing countries, about 30% population doesn't have the mobile internet connectivity, forget broadband. So when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about digital transformation, we talk about essentially about inclusion. You've heard previous speakers talking about Voice of Global South Summit. So at the beginning of our presidency, our Prime Minister reached out to all those countries which are not on the table in this mechanism and clearly understood their requirements, their priorities. And when India is approaching G20 as presidency, we are bringing all those issues, not just our issues, but the issues of all of developing countries, which is bridging the digital divide, which is digital skilling, which is digital infrastructure, financing, so on and so forth. So inclusion is there in each of our priorities, inclusion is addressed by each of the working group, and inclusion is addressed by each of the engagement groups, so to say. In startups, once we know each other and startup ecosystem in the G20 countries, again, just by knowing each other, we will address the inclusion part. Suppose a startup has to do a pilot project and it realizes that there are destinations which are more cost effective than its own or more friendlier in terms of taxation. So it can go and pilot in any other country. Suppose an Indian startup can do a pilot in Brazil if the situations are alike, and then come back and scale it up. So again, inclusion at a broader scale. So it's premature to tell what we have achieved, because we are in the middle of the process. We have put forth our agenda. We have been able to convey and convince our story, our idea behind those agenda. We have broken our agenda into sub-agenda and discussion parameters. But the process is still on. While we have, about 1/3 of formal meetings have happened. And as I said, if we include all other meetings, we will very soon reach about 100. But then we have more than halfway to go. So I would not like to prejudge the deliberations because, the agenda is put forward by the presidency, but it is further enriched through deliberations of G20 countries. And who knows, we might end up achieving more than what we initially thought when we started the journey, when all other countries bring their experiences on the table in each of the field. So I'll stop here, and I'll be willing to take any questions to make it more interactive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish, for that admirably precise presentation, for highlighting the role of startups, and above all, underlining, bringing out that how inclusion animates each of the priorities of India G20 presidency. This is a very important point. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the panel discussion. If there are any questions, we can just take 3-4 questions because it has gone far too long. So, yes, you can start. Okay, the boy there, yeah, the man there.
And we've seen rapid developments recently in regards to India, whether it's on health, discussions on trade, exchanging in our own respective currencies for goods and services with various countries, technology, UPI as we mentioned. We've seen very significant significant developments already midway through India's G20 presidency. And even though you said it's too early to prejudge, as a curious student, I still have to ask, what more can we expect in the coming months, particularly in regard with other developing countries, to bridge the gap between the North and the Global South, and to ensure that India's G20 presidency is remembered for the decades to come?
Who else? Anyone else in the question? Okay. One, three, four questions. Okay, you.
My question also relates to the trading in local currencies that's picking up recently. India released a foreign trade policy which encourages the use of rupee. So how does this help in forging financial inclusion, particularly in the global south?
Okay, Agya.
Do you think India's strategy of inter-sharing information and intelligence technology with G20 members possess a geostrategic or geopolitical conflict in a nature?
Thank you for this lovely session. I have two small questions. The first question is for the diplomat from Brazil. Given the kind of situation we are seeing between Mexico and the United States, the next G20 session might have to address what kind of strain has come between the diplomatic relations. As somebody who also has insight in the future, what would you suggest to your Sherpa and co-Sherpa back there in Rio de Janeiro, that how does the G20 under Brazil's leadership tackle such a worsening or a volatile situation between the Americans and the Mexicans? And the second question for the whole guest lobby is, given that the glimmer of hope is on India, and India is always seen as that one player that is going to be bridging the gap, is it only the kind of hope that we have with the Indians, or is there basically a pressure from the international community that it is only going to fall on India's shoulders alone to make sure there is peace, and the other actors are not going to be paid attention?
Anyone else? This is the only round we are having. Okay, the girl out there.
Okay, it's working. My question is from the chairman of High Tech Group. So currently I am researching about semiconductors and its supply chain networks and the semiconductor policy in India. So sir, since you talked about supply chains and how they have become networks that are interlinking. So can you also shed some light on how India is getting into the semiconductor industry and setting up an ecosystem? Thank you.
Excellency Ambassador Lithuania, you will have a question?
Well, my question would be, I'm Ambassador of Lithuania. My question would be to the representative of India and Brazil. I understand it was India that added Startup 20 to the list of groups. Will Brazil take it forward, and what would be India's recommendation in the end of your presidency on that particular aspect? Because I think this sector really needs continuity. It's a very global, new phenomenon which needs to be developed.
So now we will have the panelists respond. Some of the questions, have been specifically directed at you, and then move on to other panelists.
Yeah, so about the question, the first question that was asked directly to me, the recommendations I will make, the embassy will make to our Sherpa and Sous-Sherpa, it's mostly that the priorities of the G20, and this is visible in India's taking, they have a global reach. I mean, we deal with specific issues, with conflicts if necessary, of course, but the idea of the G20 is to have a global meaning, something that can be meaningful to all the countries that are members. So any dispute or friction between countries is relevant, but the truth is that it will only become an issue for the group if it doesn't find its own path. Regarding startups, I do think that, yes, at this point, as I said, it's just speculation, a guesstimate. But yes, I do think that Brazil will follow this initiative, and the startups are as important to us as they are to India, although I don't think we're as proficient in producing them as the Indians are. Thank you.
Mr. Sharp, would you have something to respond to some of the questions? Or one final closing comment?
I mean, perhaps nothing sort of directly targeting UN, but maybe just on the response to the question about is sort of the world looking to India to just take on all of the challenges and the rest step back or something? I mean, just to be a very sort of generic response, I would say definitely not. I think, basically what's happening is it's not about sort of the international community of the world, placing kind of seeking to place a burden or something on India's shoulders, but rather it's a reflection of India's, rise in the world in so many different directions, and India's unique positioning to play a very important convening role at this time of kind of polycrisis, and because India has that legitimate, has long been a voice for the global South, and has the experience of a developing country and the only lower middle income country within the G20, right? But has also demonstrated development best practice in so many of the different ways that we're speaking about. So India is uniquely positioned to kind of both demonstrate on the development side and on the bridge building political side, again, east, west, north, south, you name it. India is by force of its unique positioning able to play a role. So I think it's more a reflection of that, but certainly it does not absolve any of the other international community members and multilateral platforms as well. The UN, of course, being the largest one, but of playing an important role. So it's a partnership there, and it reflects India's own stated ambitious, inclusive, action-oriented G20 agenda, which I think has really set the momentum where we need momentum at this very moment.
Mr. Kapuria, would you have some closing comments or a quick response to one of the questions?
The response on the GVCs, specifically on the microprocessors, we all know that the microprocessor industry came to pretty much a standstill, and primarily because the demand and also the supply. The demand was none of the gadgetries which were using the microprocessors had ever been made in the pandemic times. So that was one pressure. The second was the supply chains itself, primarily which got disrupted both in terms of transporting them from one geography to the other or one country to the other. Now, what is India's position in this is that all developed and, in fact, emerging economies who have any ambition to be a global player would have to have a microprocessor capability, and starting right from the wafer. So the wafer plant, I believe, is getting to be set up. I do not have any more information than what is publicly available, but I do believe that there would be a large investment, close to what, 20 to 22 odd $billion, which would come into India in cooperation with a Taiwanese company, which would start manufacturing the wafer. So starting right from the wafer to getting to that, but it'll take some time. This was our ambition that, as I know it, more than 2 decades old. So I wish I still have my fingers crossed that it actually happens.
Right. Ashish, one final comment or word quickly? Or to any of the question you want to take on?
Yeah, there were many questions, so I think it's only fair that we could address some of those. So the young man there, when I said it's premature, it's not with any despair or pessimism. We're actually, G20 is a consensus-driven process, and presidency's responsibility is to put forward the agenda. When I say this premature, I really believe that whatever we have put forward will not only be achieved, but will be further enriched by other member countries. Now, what would Indian presidency be remembered for? Of course, I would like it to be remembered for multiple things. To start with, Indian presidency is going to give to the world the concept of lifestyle for environment, bringing an absolutely novel idea of individual behavior, nudging an individual behavior towards environmental sustainability. From mindless consumption to mindful utilization. That if an individual's behavior is conditioned, then a community behavior, and then further it goes up. And from the business's point of view, the circular economy. So lifestyle for environment is what is our presidency's priority, and it runs across the working groups, and we are getting very good response from many countries. We would also like to be remembered for the 2 initiatives taken during our presidency, which is Startup 20 and disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction is so important for developing countries that the world, and if I take G20 as a sample, 10% of the investment in infrastructure is washed away or damaged by the disasters. So if we have a system of early warning, if we create an infrastructure which is disaster resilient, we can save up to 10% of the total investment every year. So we would like to be remembered for that. We would like to be remembered for inclusion. We would like to be remembered for bringing the voice of the global south. We would like to be remembered for bringing back the focus on achievement of SDGs, which was severely crippled by the challenges of pandemic and geopolitical tension. We also brought the focus back on the supply chain disruptions leading to the triple F crisis, which is food, fuel, fertilizer crisis, which is impacting everyone. So, in total, it has to be, we have worked very intensively and gone into deep diving on the issue of sovereign debts. And I'm happy to inform to you that in the recently held finance ministers meeting, FMCBG in Bangalore, there was a consensus on the debt paragraph, which was not there in the Indonesian presidency in Bali. If you see Bali declaration, Bali document, one country has disassociated with the paragraph on debt, and it is in the footnote. That country is back in the main document, and there's a full consensus. So presidency will be remembered for multiple things. I would not name one, and I would also like to curiously wait that how many more things can be added. But please wait and watch, and be optimistic about this. Thanks. The next was about the rupee. That's again an inclusion. If there are 30 countries which will trade with India without being dependent on dollar, which is not the idea. The idea is not to discard dollar. The idea is to maintain the supply chain. The idea is to maintain the supply of food, fuel, fertilizer to everyone. And if with 30 countries we are able to do that without any potential disruptions due to any of the geopolitical situation, that's an inclusion of sorts.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ashish. Thanks for summing up in a sense, and doing my work in the sense that what would be some of the key major contributions of India's presidency, which is still a work in progress. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we have come to the end of a very marathon session. I admire the heroism of all the people who have stood by right till the end, their patience and persistence for listening to all of them. So, audience needs to be thanked in a way first. But it's not about being first and last. My profuse thanks to all the speakers, all the splendid speakers. As I said, it's a unique fortune to have such a constellation of speakers. So let me thank Sri Harshvardhan Shringla in absentia right now, he's off. Dr. Amar Patnaik, Ambassador of Indonesia, Ina Krishnamurthy, UN Resident Coordinator in India, Mr. Shombi Shah, Mr. Eduardo Uziel, Mr. Deep Kapuria, Mr. Ashish Kumar Sinha. Thank you to all of you for your, very thoughtful, very incisive contribution to the unfolding debate and discourse on India's presidency. Dear friends, we have come to a very enormously enriching discussion, and it would be not be fair for me, given the paucity of time, or not even dare to try to summarize such a rich discussion. I believe each of you will have your takeaways, you carrying something from here. Just very briefly, 4 or 5 bullet points in terms of major takeaways. So what we gathered from this discussion, that there's across the board consensus that inclusivity or inclusion should be the centerpiece of the G20 agenda of economic transformation and whatever else it does. Number 2 takeaway, India's G20 presidency, coming as it does in the midst of, interlocking crisis, is a huge opportunity for bolstering, for rejuvenating multilateralism, because we sail or sink together, So this whole idea that the system is broken, the multilateralism is broken, that is going to be very much the focus, that how we can have a more effective multilateralism. Number 3, reforming global governance architecture has acquired a note of urgency. It cannot be postponed further. This eternal deferral must stop. The 4th, that it is in many ways India's G20 moment, but it's also the moment of the global South. To recast the G20, to reflect the priorities and interests of the emerging countries, the successive presidencies of IPSA countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, offers an unprecedented opportunity. So these are some of the key takeaways of what we, this almost 2 hour, more than 2 hour long discussion. My thanks to you all once again for finding time, coming here, staying on right till the end. And now I won't hold you back from the lunch. Lunch is waiting for you. We had a lot of food for thought. Now it's time for some real food. Thank you.